Let me start today with something that I want you to really sit with for a second, because I think most of you, and I include myself in this, have been getting this war completely wrong. And the reason we've been getting it wrong is not because we're unintelligent. It's because the way this conflict is being presented in the media is systematically designed to make you look at the wrong thing. So here's what I want to do today. I want to take the thing that everyone is talking about, the airstrikes, the missiles, the oil, and I want to show you what is actually underneath all of that, the structural logic, the hidden architecture. And then at the end, I'm going to give you 3 very specific predictions about what happens next with specific signals to watch so you can verify those predictions yourself. Okay? That's the plan. But first, yesterday morning, let's start there. Yesterday morning, the Washington Post published an article citing an internal assessment from multiple United States intelligence agencies. And I want to be very precise here because the sourcing matters. This was not a leak from a disgruntled official. This was a coordinated intelligence community assessment, the kind that gets circulated at the highest levels of the US government. And their conclusion, the CIA's conclusion, the conclusion of American intelligence was this. The United States and Iran are locked in an indefinite limbo between peace and war. Indefinite limbo. Those are the words. Now let me give you the full context so you understand why those words are extraordinary. The United States has just completed the 11th consecutive night of airstrikes against Iran. 11 nights in a row without a single night off. They have spent, as of this morning, $37.5 billion on this conflict. That number comes directly from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who testified before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee and confirmed it under oath. And then, in the same testimony, he asked for $67.1 billion more. Let me say that again slowly. $37.5 billion already spent, $67.1 billion more being requested, over $100 billion total. For a war that President Trump told the American public would be fast, decisive, and not particularly expensive. And at the exact same time, this money is being spent. These bombs are being dropped. These missiles are flying. The CIA is privately telling the government that they cannot win. Does that make sense? Because it should not make sense. Unless you understand what's really happening underneath. And that's what we're going to unpack today. Quick disclaimer before we go further. Everything I'm going to tell you is based on publicly available information. I could be wrong. I'm going to give you the sources, walk you through the logic, and I strongly encourage you to challenge me wherever you see a gap. That's not false modesty. That's how this kind of analysis should work. All right, let's dig in. To understand why this war is a stalemate, you first need to understand the mechanism. Why does the most powerful military in human history, dropping bombs every single night for 11 nights, end up being told by its own intelligence community that it's in indefinite limbo? How is that possible? I want to give you a framework for this. I call it the mechanical escalation trap. And once you understand this framework, I promise you will recognize it in every major military conflict of the past 50 years. Here is how the trap works. When a great power launches an air campaign against a state that has deliberately decentralized its military structure, the air campaign creates a paradox. Every target you destroy generates new targets because the enemy disperses and adapts. Every escalation you make forces the other side to match or exceed it, because backing down means losing political legitimacy at home. And there is no clearly defined political end state, no specific condition you can point to and say, that's when we stop. So the machine keeps going. You strike, they strike back. You strike harder, they strike back harder. The target list expands, the geographic scope expands, the cost expands automatically. A former US Pentagon official named David DeRoches described this exact dynamic as, and I'm quoting directly, a mechanical ratcheting of escalation. That's a phrase, mechanical ratcheting. Like a gear that only clicks forward and never back. And that's where the United States and Iran are right now. Both locked in a ratchet, neither side can easily reverse without losing face. What the United States is doing, and why it's not enough, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, conducted its 10th, 11th consecutive nights of airstrikes on July 21st and 22nd. Officially, they were targeting Iranian military command centers, maritime interdiction capabilities, radar and air defense systems, unmanned aerial vehicle launch platforms, and ballistic missile infrastructure in southern Iran. The most symbolically significant single strike in this period was the attack on the Darkovin nuclear facility in Khuzestan province. Iran had been constructing this plant for years, gone. And I'll come back to the strategic implications of that strike later, because they are not what you think. At sea, the USS Boxer, an amphibious assault ship, disabled one commercial vessel and forced 7 other merchant ships to divert their routes away from the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM is publicly claiming they have provided safe passage for 900 commercial ships carrying a total of 450 million barrels of crude oil since operations began. That all sounds impressive. 11 nights of bombing, a nuclear facility struck, a naval blockade being enforced. I want to acknowledge that because I don't want to minimize the scale of what the United States is doing. They are applying enormous pressure. The question is whether that pressure is translating into strategic results. And this is where the picture gets complicated. Here is what the United States military has not fully internalized. Even after Vietnam, even after Afghanistan, even after Iraq, Iran completely decentralized its military command structure a long time ago. Each military region has its own chain of command, its own operational authority, its own contingency plans, and its own communications infrastructure that does not depend on Tehran. You can degrade the central command in the capital, and the outlying units keep fighting on independent orders. The head does not control the body in the traditional sense anymore. Shock and awe doesn't work against this structure. Decapitation strikes don't work against this structure. The United States learned this in Iraq. They learned this in Afghanistan. And yet here we are, what Iran is doing and why it's working. Now let's look at what Iran has been doing during the same period, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating from a strategic perspective. While CENTCOM was running its strikes, Iran executed Phase 21 and 22 of what they officially call Operation Nasr II, and Phase 21 of Operation Salehe. These are not informal attacks. These are named, numbered operational phases. This is a pre-planned campaign being executed on a schedule. In Bahrain, the CENTCOM data center, a Patriot missile battery and radar at Sheikh Issa Air Base. In Kuwait, a Patriot system and radar at Ali Al Salim Air Base. In Jordan, a C-17 military transport and a P-8 maritime patrol aircraft at Aqaba Airport, described as heavily damaged. Missiles used: Hibr Shakan, Fateh 110, Zolfagar, and Mad. These are precision ballistic missiles with single-digit meter accuracy. And here's the quote I want you to remember. Trump himself said publicly about Jordan, "They got through in Jordan. If we had different operators, that wouldn't have happened." An Iranian ballistic missile hit a US military aircraft at a Jordanian airport in a war that is supposedly going well. Hormuz, not one drop of oil. Now we need to talk about the most important single variable in this conflict, not the airstrikes, not the missiles. A body of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The IRGC has issued a formal statement. Not one drop of oil, not one package of chemical fertilizer will be exported while American aggression continues. On July 21st, a tanker was struck and the crew had to abandon ship. 2 other vessels exploded attempting to transit the strait. CENTCOM says they've escorted 900 ships through. So is the strait open or not? Here is the simplest test you can apply. Look at the oil price. Brent crude is above $91 a barrel. If Hormuz were genuinely functioning, if 900 ships are freely transiting, that price is impossible. It would be at $65, maybe $70. $91 oil is a financial market pricing real, sustained closure risk. The market has no propaganda agenda. The market prices reality, and the market is telling you the strait is not fully open. The dual choke point strategy, but here's the thing almost nobody is connecting. Hormuz is only half the problem. Iran is running what I'm calling a dual choke point strategy. Choke point 1, Hormuz. 20% of all globally traded crude oil transits here every day. All the oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, going to Japan, South Korea, China, India, and much of Europe. Iran is interdicting it. Choke point 2, Bab el-Mandab. The Houthis in Yemen, coordinating closely with Iran, have just declared a maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia, threatening any vessel calling at Saudi ports. The Bab el-Mandab is the safety valve. When Hormuz is dangerous, Saudi Arabia exports through the Red Sea instead. Iran is trying to close both exits simultaneously. If this strategy works even partially, 25% of all globally transported oil and gas locked down. American gas prices already at $4 a gallon, $4.35 in some states. US midterm elections in November. Iran strategists absolutely know this calendar. The timing is not coincidental. Now I want to show you the most important signal coming out of the past 48 hours. One that almost every news outlet is completely missing. While the United States is bombing Iran every night, they are simultaneously pushing a three-party framework agreement, US, Israel, and Lebanon, requiring Israel to withdraw from test zones in southern Lebanon and requiring the disarmament of Hezbollah. Trump personally met with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun at the White House in the same 48-hour window. Here's the strategic logic underneath that you won't hear on CNN. Iran's most important bargaining chip in any potential negotiation with the United States has always been Hezbollah, not the nuclear program, Hezbollah. Any comprehensive deal that Iran might sign, the framework being negotiated through Qatar's Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding explicitly requires that any ceasefire include Lebanon. Iran has tied the two theaters together. Lebanon is Iran's insurance policy on the negotiating table. So when the United States moves to resolve Lebanon on a separate bilateral track, independent of the Iran negotiations, the strategic effect is they are stripping Iran of its most valuable card before Iran can use it. They're saying, we've taken care of Lebanon ourselves, now come to the table with one less piece of leverage. That is smart, but the fact that they feel compelled to do it is itself a signal. A country winning decisively doesn't need to preemptively neutralize the other side's diplomatic hand. They just keep winning. The need to do this tells you about the pressure they're actually under. The American Domestic Picture former National Counterterrorism Center Director Joe Kent has said publicly that the United States has reached what he called a strategic dead end and cannot defeat Iran militarily. He is calling for immediate negotiations. Trump's approval rating is 36%, 60% disapprove. That is the lowest of both his terms combined, according to economists in YouGov polling this week. In the Senate hearing, Hegseth was called a failure on live television. Senator Patty Murray pointed out that Trump has claimed more than 40 times a deal is imminent and the war is almost over, and now he's asking for $70 billion more. Senator Gillibrand accused the administration of seeking unlimited money for bombs while cutting healthcare, housing, and support for American farmers. This is not a government that is winning. This is a government that is looking for a way to say it won without having actually won. Okay? Now let me describe a chess move that Iran is making that I think is genuinely sophisticated and that almost nobody in English language media is fully explaining. When the US struck Darkovin, Iran immediately filed a formal legal submission with the IAEA Director General and the UN Security Council, characterizing the strike as a threat to global nuclear safety. The IAEA responded extremely weakly. They confirmed no nuclear materials were present and said there was no radiological risk. Russia condemned the IAEA as blind and deaf to the attacks. What does Iran actually want from this exchange? Not protection. They don't expect the IAEA to stop American bombing. What they want is to establish on the international record that the IAEA is a biased institution. Why? Because the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, the framework for any potential Iran-US deal, contains a clause requiring Iran's enriched uranium to be diluted under an IAEA monitor mechanism. That's the cornerstone verification clause. If Iran can successfully argue the IAEA is politically compromised and the weak Darkovin response gives them exactly that argument, then Iran has the legal and political basis to demand IAEA be removed from any verification role in a future deal entirely. And Iran has now domestically legislated that any IAEA inspection must receive advance approval from the Supreme National Security Council. That's a built-in veto on inspections. This is a three-step sequence. Darkovin strike, weak IAEA response, Russia backs Iran's narrative. Iran uses that to remove inspection requirements from any deal, executed in 72 hours. Okay? Now I want to do something I try to do in every video. I want to present the strongest possible version of the argument that I'm disagreeing with, because you should always test your analysis against the best counter-argument, not the weakest. Here is the strongest case that the United States is winning. The US military has destroyed Iranian infrastructure at unprecedented scale and tempo. Iran has lost senior military figures. Pezeshkian has publicly acknowledged domestic inflation near 90%, which creates real political pressure. CENTCOM says 900 ships have transited Hormuz. There are signs of internal fracture in Tehran. And no country can sustain a war against the world's preeminent military power indefinitely. Eventually, the economic degradation and domestic unrest add up. Iran will blink. That is coherent. Parts of it are true. I acknowledge that fully. But here are the specific things that argument cannot explain. Rebuttal 1. Iran already rebuilt its missiles. The Wall Street Journal, based on satellite imagery and independent military analysis, reported this week that Iran has already reconstituted a portion of its ballistic missile capability after US and Israeli strikes. They are still launching ballistic missiles every single day at US bases in the region. If 11 nights of precision strikes were genuinely destroying Iranian offensive capacity in any sustainable way, those launches would be declining in volume and accuracy. They are not. The operational tempo is roughly constant. That is the key data point that the Iran will blink theory cannot explain. Rebuttal 2. The oil price does not lie. CENTCOM says 900 ships. The oil price says $91 a barrel. If you believe the CENTCOM number fully, the oil price makes no sense. If you believe the oil price, the CENTCOM number requires serious qualification. The financial market is not partisan. It prices forward-looking risk. $91 oil is the market pricing real Hormuz closure risk. That directly contradicts the narrative of successful navigation protection. Rebuttal 3. The arithmetic is merciless. If the United States is winning, why does Pete Hegseth need $67 billion more? $37.5 billion spent. $67.1 billion more requested. Over $100 billion total. For a war that was supposed to be fast and decisive. And the result, Hormuz partially blocked. Iran still firing. No regime change. CIA says indefinite limbo. Senator Ossoff asked Hegseth this question directly. No convincing answer. The arithmetic does not support the victory narrative. Why Iran will not break? The Melis lesson. Let me go deeper on the psychology here, because I think this is the most important thing to understand about why the Iran will eventually blink theory keeps being wrong. There is a story in ancient Greek history called the Melian Dialogue, recorded by Thucydides. The Athenians besieged the neutral island of Melos. They said, "The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must." The Melians believed their moral argument and their neutrality would protect them. They were completely wrong. Athens killed every adult male on the island and sold the women and children into slavery. Iran studied that story. They watched Gaddafi give up his weapons program in 2003 after a deal with the West and get overthrown in a NATO-backed intervention in 2011. They watched Soleimani get assassinated by an American drone in Baghdad in January 2020 in what was functionally a peacetime targeted killing. They watched Iraq. They watched Afghanistan. And they drew one singular conclusion. The only way to survive against the United States is to make the cost of defeating you permanently and incredibly higher than any possible benefit the US could derive from your defeat. Not to win, just to make it not worth winning. That's why they built the Shahad drone, $50,000 each, specifically to be intercepted by American THAAD missiles that cost $1 million apiece. For every 20 drones Iran fires, it drains $20 million of American military budget. That ratio is built into the design cost-imposing strategy at the engineering level. That's why they dug underground fortresses into the rock of Karg Island and Keshm Island, commanding the Hormuz approaches, what they call unsinkable aircraft carriers. They don't float, they don't move, and they cannot be sunk. And that's why Pezeshkian can declare total war against the world's most powerful military while acknowledging 90% domestic inflation. Because the political cost of capitulating, of becoming the Iranian government that surrendered and ended up like Gaddafi, is, in their calculation, higher than the economic cost of continuing. That is a rational actor making a rational calculation under extreme duress. Okay? Take X Mountain. why this threat is probably not a plan. Trump has said he will hit Pickett's Mountain soon and very heavily. Kulakup near Isfahan, a hardened underground nuclear complex. Sounds dramatic. Here is why I believe this is leverage rather than an operational order. 5 reasons. 1. Geology. This facility is inside a mountain, not under soft earth. Even the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the deepest penetrating conventional bomb the US possesses, 30,000 pounds, carried only by B-2 stealth bombers, may not guarantee penetration at this depth. Multiple sequential passes on the same penetration point in a contested air environment. Extremely high risk. 2. Intelligence uncertainty. Trump himself conditionally said the strike would not make sense unless they have nuclear material there. That means the CIA has not given him a high confidence assessment that fissile material is present. You cannot bomb a nuclear site without knowing what you're bombing. 3. Ordnance logistics. Senior Pentagon officials have privately told reporters the US military does not have sufficient stockpiles to sustain the current daily operational tempo and simultaneously plan a major hardened facility strike. This is a physical constraint, not a political one. 4. Iranian retaliation credibility. Khatam al-Anbiya Command has explicitly warned any nuclear facility strike means expansion of war to the entire West Asia theater. Iran has already proven it can hit US bases in Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait simultaneously. That threat is credible. 5. The international radioactive nightmare. Russia, China, and European governments have privately warned Washington that striking Iranian nuclear infrastructure risks a Chernobyl-scale radiological event affecting Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and beyond. The geopolitical cost would be generational. Pickaxe Mountain is a lever Trump is pulling to pressure Iran. It is less likely an imminent operational plan. That is my assessment, held with moderate confidence. Before the predictions, I want to zoom out. Because if you only understand the event, you'll be surprised every time something happens. But if you understand the structure that generates the event, you start to see the next move before it's announced. Hans Morgenthau, one of the founding figures of modern international relations theory, wrote that great powers are always tempted to, quote, cloak their own particular aspirations and actions in the moral purposes of the universe. In plain English, powerful countries always find a moral-sounding justification for doing what they plan to do for strategic reasons anyway. And the justification always sounds reasonable because it's constructed by smart people whose job is to make it sound reasonable. Look at the Iran war. The United States says it is defending freedom of navigation, but the USS Boxer is blockading Iranian ports. That is an act of economic warfare, not navigation protection. The United States says it is preventing nuclear proliferation, but in the same week they destroyed Darkovin. The Trump administration finalized a 123 agreement with Saudi Arabia, a civilian nuclear cooperation deal giving Saudi Arabia American nuclear technology, with no prohibition on domestic enrichment and no robust inspection safeguards. So Iran is being bombed for its nuclear program, while Saudi Arabia, Iran's regional rival, gets American nuclear technology. That is not a coherent non-proliferation policy. It is a coherent strategic power play. Presidential advisor Stephen Miller stated publicly, "We live in the real world, governed by power, violence, and force. That is realpolitik without the moral dressing." And in its honesty, it is the most accurate description of the logic driving this conflict that any American official has given. Iran is doing the same thing, of course. The axis of resistance narrative dresses up Iranian strategic power projection in the language of anti-imperialism. The costume is different, the body underneath is the same. Everyone has their moral narrative. The moral narrative is the costume. The strategic interest is the body. Once you learn to separate them, geopolitics becomes a great deal clearer. All right, 3 predictions. These are falsifiable, specific claims. Write them down. Come back in 30, 60, 90 days. Tell me where I was right and where I was wrong. That's the deal. Prediction 1, Pakistan-Qatar diplomacy will fail at least one more round. That's the deal. Iran's interior minister flew to Islamabad within the last 48 hours and met personally with Pakistani PM Sharif and Army Chief General Asim Munir, carrying a special message from Pezeshkian. Qatar is running a parallel back channel. The infrastructure of a deal is being built. But Iran just arrested 2 French diplomats. France is a potential guarantor of any deal, and Pezeshkian's spokesperson explicitly said military operations and diplomatic talks will proceed simultaneously. Iran is fighting and negotiating at the same time, using each to strengthen their position in the other. The gap between American demands, verifiable enrichment suspension, IAEA access, proxy disarmament, and what Iran can politically deliver without losing the Revolutionary Guard remains enormous. The signal to watch: Rubio's language. He currently says Iran is not serious. If you ever hear him shift to Iran has taken meaningful steps toward our core objectives, or our framework agreement is within reach, that shift is the first signal the US has privately decided to declare limited victory and de-escalate. The language changes before the policy does, always. Prediction 2. Houthi escalation at Bab el-Mandeb. Before November midterms, the Houthis have declared a maritime blockade of Saudi Arabia. This is the second arm of Iran's dual choke point strategy. Gas prices are already at $4 a gallon. If Houthi operations push oil prices higher toward $5 at the pump in October 2026, 1 month before midterms, the political damage to the Republican Party is severe. Iran and the Houthis know this calendar. The timing is a deliberate strategic calculation against Trump's domestic vulnerability. The signal to watch: Saudi production decisions. If Saudi Arabia begins cutting production or publicly distances itself from American security guarantees, that signals real Houthi pressure and a Saudi calculation that reducing output is safer than fighting to export through a contested strait. Prediction 3. US declares limited victory and quietly de-escalates in Q4 2026. The arithmetic is simple. Ground invasion, politically impossible. Pickaxe Mountain, deeply problematic for 5 reasons I've listed. Ordnance stockpiles, depleted. CIA assessment, indefinite limbo. Trump approval, 36%. Midterms, November. Basing vulnerability, Al-Udeid 170 miles from Iran. Bahrain 128. Kuwait 62. No path to actual military victory. Every serious US military and intelligence professional knows this. The CIA said so. So what happens is what always happens after inconclusive American military interventions. The United States finds a version of events it can label as success. We destroyed Iran's nuclear infrastructure. We degraded their military. We secured allied shipping. We demonstrated American resolve. Mission accomplished. None of those claims will be fully true. Each will be partially defensible. Partial truth, packaged for a domestic audience before an election, is sufficient to declare a political win. The signal to watch: any quiet prisoner exchange, any back-channel US-Iran meeting that leaks through Qatari or Pakistani channels, any shift in IAEA language toward Iran, any third-party mediator announcement about a breakthrough. Secret diplomacy precedes public announcement by weeks. When you see those signals, de-escalation has already started. All right. 4 pieces of homework, and then I've got 1 question for you. Homework 1, read the Washington Post article on the US intelligence assessment of Iran. Find the phrase indefinite limbo between peace and war. Read the full article, not just a headline. Primary sources matter. Homework 2, read Iran's formal submission to the IAEA and the UN Security Council about the Dark Line strike. Read what they actually said, not what was reported. There's often a significant difference, and the difference tells you the strategy. Homework 3, read the Wall Street Journal report on Iran reconstituting its missile capability. Look at the satellite imagery analysis. Ask yourself whether what you're reading is consistent with the narrative that Iran has been militarily neutralized. Homework 4, most important, requires no reading. Open any financial app and track Brent crude oil prices every day for the next 2 weeks, not to trade. To use as ground truth for what's actually happening in Hormuz. If prices fall significantly towards $70, the strait is opening. If prices stay at or above $90, the strait is still effectively closed, regardless of any press release from any government. Now, the question I want to leave you with: $37.5 billion spent, 11 consecutive nights of bombing. Iran is still firing ballistic missiles at US bases. The Strait of Hormuz is still effectively closed. The CIA says indefinite limbo. The United States knows it cannot win this militarily. Iran knows it cannot defeat the United States militarily. Both sides have known this from approximately week 1. And yet the machine keeps running, the bombs keep falling, the missiles keep launching, the money keeps flowing, $100 billion and counting. So here's the real question. Not who is winning, not who is losing, who benefits from this war never ending, and why is that actor never the one who appears in the headlines? Think about that. I'll see you in the next one.